pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, knight f3, castles kingside, bishop e2, pawn e5, castles kingside, knight c6, pawn d5, knight e7, knight d2, pawn a5, pawn a3, knight d7, rook b1, pawn f5, pawn b4, king h8, pawn f3, knight g8, queen c2, pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, knight d7, f6, pawn c5, knight h5, knight c4, knight f4, pawn takes d6, pawn takes d6, knight b5, rook a6, rook b3, pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, bishop d7, knight c3, rook a1, bishop takes f4, rook takes f1, bishop takes f1, pawn takes f4, queen f2, knight h6, pawn h3, knight f7, knight e2, knight g5, knight takes f4, queen f6, pawn g3, knight takes e4, queen e3, knight takes g3, queen takes g3, queen takes f4, queen takes f4, rook takes f4, pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, bishop e2, Castles kingside. Knight f3. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Knight d2. Pawn a5. Pawn a3. Knight d7. Rook b1. Pawn f5. Pawn b4. King h8. Pawn f3. Knight g8. Queen c2. Knight g8 f6. Knight b5. Pawn takes b4. Pawn takes b4. Knight h5. Pawn g3. Knight d7 f6. Pawn c5. Bishop d7. Rook b3. Pawn takes e4. Pawn takes e4. Bishop h3. Rook e1. Bishop h6. Knight f3. Bishop takes c1. Rook takes c1. Knight g4. Queen d2. Queen e7. Rook b3, c3. Pawn h6. Bishop f1. Bishop takes f1. Rook takes f1. Pawn g5. Pawn takes d6. Pawn takes d6. Knight c7. Knight g4 f6. Knight takes g5. Pawn takes g5. Knight takes a8. Knight takes e4. Rook takes f8. Queen takes f8. Queen e2. Knight h5 f6. Rook a3. Queen c8. King g2. Queen c1. Rook f3. Pawn b5. Knight b6. Queen c7. Queen takes b5. Queen c2. King g1. Queen d1. Rook f1. Queen d4. King h1. Knight f2. King g2. Knight f2 g4. Queen e2. Queen takes b6. Rook e1. Queen takes b4. Pawn h3. Knight h6. Rook f1. King g7. King h2. Queen e4. Queen a2. Queen takes d5. Queen a7. King g6. Queen a1. Knight f5. Queen b1. Pawn e4. Queen b2. Queen e5. Queen takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Rook e1. Knight d4. King g2. King f5. Rook f1. King e6. Rook a1. Pawn e3. Rook a6. King f5. Pawn g4. King g6. Rook a3. Knight d5. Rook a6. King f7. Rook a5. King e6. Rook a6. King d7. Rook a5. King c6. Rook a6. King c5. King f1. Knight f4. Rook a5. King d6. Rook a6. King d5. Rook a3. King e4. Rook a2. King f3. Pawn h4. Pawn takes h4. Pawn g5. Pawn e2. Rook takes e2. Knight d4 takes e2. King e1. Pawn h3. King d2. Pawn h2. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop e2. Castles kingside. Knight f3. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6, pawn d5, knight e7, knight d2, pawn a5, rook b1, knight d7, pawn a3, pawn f5, pawn b4, king h8, pawn f3, pawn f4, knight b3, pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, pawn g5, bishop d2, knight g6, rook a1, rook takes a1, queen takes a1, knight f6, queen a7, pawn g4, pawn takes g4, knight takes g4, pawn h3, knight h6, bishop e1, rook g8, knight d2, bishop f6, king h1, bishop h4, knight f3, bishop takes e1, knight takes e1, knight h4, rook f2, queen g5, knight f3, knight takes f3, bishop takes f3, bishop takes h3, queen takes b7, bishop takes g2, bishop takes g2, pawn f3, king g1, queen c1, knight f3, pawn g6, pawn e4, bishop g7, pawn d4, pawn d6, pawn c4, knight f6, knight c3, castles kingside, bishop e2, pawn e5, castles kingside, knight c6, bishop e3, knight g4, bishop g5, pawn f6, bishop c1, pawn f5, bishop g5, bishop f6, bishop takes f6, Knight takes f6. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Queen takes d8. Rook takes d8. Knight d5. Knight takes e4. Knight takes c7. Rook b8. Rook f1, d1. Bishop d7. Bishop d3. Rook b8, c8. Knight d5. Knight c5. Bishop f1. Bishop e6. Pawn b4. Bishop takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Knight takes b4. Knight takes e5. Knight e4. Bishop c4. Knight c3. Rook d2. Knight b4 takes d5. Pawn g3. King g7. King g2. Knight e3. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Knight f3. Castles kingside. Bishop e2. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Knight d2. Knight e8. Rook b1. Pawn f5. Pawn b4. Knight f6. Pawn f3. Pawn f4. Pawn c5. Pawn g5. Knight c4. Knight g6. Pawn a4. Rook f7. Bishop a3. Bishop f8. Pawn a5. Rook g7. Pawn b5. Pawn b6. Pawn takes d6. Pawn takes d6. Knight a2. Pawn g4. Pawn takes g4. Knight h4. Rook b3. Knight takes g4. Bishop f3. Pawn takes a5. Queen d2. Pawn a4. Rook c3. Bishop d7. Rook b1. Rook c8. King h1. Knight takes h2. King takes h2. Rook takes c4. Rook b1, c1. Knight takes f3. Rook takes f3. Queen h4. King g1. Rook takes e4. Queen f2. Queen h5. Rook c7. Rook e1. Queen takes e1. Queen takes f3. Queen d2. Queen g4. Knight c3. Pawn f3. Rook takes a7. Queen h3. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Knight f3. Pawn g6. Pawn c4. Bishop g7. Knight c3. Castles kingside. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop e2. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Pawn b4. Knight h5. Pawn c5. Knight f4. Bishop takes f4. Pawn takes f4. Rook c1. Pawn a5. Pawn takes d6. Pawn takes d6. Knight b5. Bishop g4. Rook c7. Pawn takes b4. Queen d2. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3. Bishop e5. Rook takes b7. Queen a5. Knight d4. Queen takes a2. Queen takes a2. Rook takes a2. Rook takes b4. Rook f8, a8. Bishop g4. Bishop takes d4. Rook takes d4. Pawn g5. Pawn h4. Pawn takes h4. King h2. Knight g6. King h3. Rook b2. Bishop f5. Knight e5. King takes h4. Pawn h6. Bishop h3. King g7. Rook d4, d1. Rook a8, a2. Pawn f3. Knight g6. King g4. King f6. Rook b1. Pawn h5. King takes h5. Rook a8. King g4. Rook h8. Pawn g3. Rook h2. Rook h1. Rook h8 takes h3. Rook takes h2. Rook takes h2. Pawn takes f4. Rook g2. King h3. Knight takes f4. King h4. King e5. Rook b7. King d4. Rook takes f7. King e3. Knight f3. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn d4. Castles kingside. Bishop e2. Knight c6. Castles kingside. Pawn e5. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Pawn a4. Pawn a5. Knight e1. Knight d7. Bishop e3. Pawn f5. Pawn f3. Knight c5. Knight d3. Pawn b6. Pawn b4. Knight takes d3. Queen takes d3. Pawn takes b4. Knight b5, king h8, queen b3, knight g8, queen takes b4, knight f6, pawn takes f5, pawn takes f5, bishop g5, pawn h6, bishop h4, bishop d7, rook a3, queen b8, bishop f2, rook g8, rook b1, knight h5, king h1, queen d8, pawn a5, bishop takes b5, queen takes b5, pawn takes a5, pawn g3, pawn f4, pawn g4, pawn e4, pawn takes e4, knight f6, bishop h4, queen e7, bishop f3, queen e5, rook e1, knight h7, queen d7, bishop f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, queen f5, queen takes f5, pawn e4 takes f5, knight takes g4, bishop takes g4, rook takes g4, rook h3, king g7, rook e7, king f6, rook e6, king takes f5, rook h3 takes h6, rook f8, rook h5, rook g5, rook takes g5, king takes g5, pawn c5, pawn a4, pawn takes d6, pawn takes d6, rook takes d6, rook a8, rook e6, pawn a3, rook e1, king f5, pawn h4, pawn f3, pawn d6, pawn a2, rook a1, king f4, king h2, pawn f2, pawn d7, king f3, rook c1, pawn a1, rook takes a1, rook takes A1, pawn D8, rook H1, king takes H1, pawn F1, king H2, queen G2, pawn D4, knight F6, pawn C4, pawn G6, knight C3, bishop G7, pawn E4, pawn D6, bishop E2, castles kingside, knight F3, pawn E5, castles kingside, knight C6, pawn D5, knight E7, knight E1, knight E8, bishop E3, pawn F5, pawn F3, pawn F4, bishop F2, pawn H5, pawn C5, pawn G5, pawn takes D6, pawn takes D6, pawn A4, knight G6, knight B5, pawn A6, knight A3, knight F6, knight C4, pawn G4, queen B3, pawn G3, pawn takes G3, pawn takes G3, bishop takes G3, pawn H4, bishop H2, knight H5, queen B6, queen G5, knight D3, knight G3, rook F2, knight takes E2, rook takes E2, rook takes F3, knight takes D6, rook takes D3, knight takes C8, king H7, knight D6, knight F4, bishop takes F4, pawn takes F4, knight F5, rook G8, queen takes B7, pawn F3, rook F2, rook D2, queen A7, king H8, Queen e3. Queen takes e3. Knight takes e3. Bishop d4. Rook takes d2. Bishop takes e3. King h2. Bishop takes d2. Pawn takes f3. Rook g3. Rook d1. Bishop f4. Pawn d6. Rook takes f3. King g2. Rook g3. King h1. Rook g8. Pawn d7. Rook d8. King g2. King g7. Rook d5. Bishop c7. Pawn b4. King f7. Pawn a5. Rook g8. King h3. Bishop d8. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b5. Rook takes b5. Rook g3. King h2. Rook a3. Rook h5. King e6. Pawn a6. King takes d7. Rook h6. Bishop g5. Rook h5. Bishop e7. Rook h6. Rook a4. Pawn e5. Rook a5. Rook b6. Rook takes e5. Pawn a7. Rook a5. Rook b7. King e6. King h3. Rook a4. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop e2. Castles kingside. Knight f3. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Knight e1. Knight d7. Knight d3. pawn f5, bishop d2, knight f6, pawn f3, pawn f4, pawn c5, pawn g5, pawn takes d6, pawn takes d6, knight f2, knight g6, pawn a4, rook f7, knight b5, pawn h5, pawn h3, bishop f8, queen c2, pawn a6, knight a3, rook g7, rook f1, c1, knight h4, queen d1, bishop d7, knight c4, pawn g4, pawn h3 takes g4, pawn takes g4, pawn takes g4, knight takes g2, king takes g2, knight takes g4, bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, rook takes g4, knight takes g4, rook c8, knight h2, queen h4, rook c3, rook c7, rook g1, rook g7, king h1, rook takes g1, king takes g1, queen h7, bishop takes f4, pawn takes f4, knight d2, queen d7, rook c4, bishop g7, pawn b3, bishop d4, king h1, bishop c5, knight d2, f3, pawn b5, rook c2, queen e8, rook g2, king f8, knight g5, queen h5, knight e6, king e7, rook g7, king f6, rook g4, pawn takes a4, pawn takes a4, bishop e3, knight takes f4, bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, king e7, king g2, queen d1, Knight g4. Queen takes a4. Knight e3. Pawn a5. Knight f5. King d7. Rook h4. Queen c2. King f3. Pawn a4. Rook h7. King d8. Rook a7. Queen d3. Knight e3. Pawn a3. King f4. Queen b3. Knight f5. Queen b2. Knight f3. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn d4. Castles kingside. Bishop e2. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Knight e1. Knight d7. Bishop e3. Pawn f5. Pawn f3. Pawn f4. Bishop f2. Pawn g5. Pawn a4. Knight g6. Knight d3. Knight f6. Pawn c5. Pawn h5. Pawn h3. Rook f7. Pawn c6. Pawn a5. Pawn takes b7. Bishop takes b7. Pawn b4. Bishop c8. Pawn takes a5. Bishop h6. Knight b4. Pawn g4. Knight c6. Queen f8. Pawn f3 takes g4. Pawn takes g4. Pawn takes g4. Bishop g5. Bishop f3. Queen h6. Rook e1. Knight h4. Bishop takes h4. Bishop takes h4. Pawn g5. Queen takes g5. Rook e2. Knight g4. Rook b1. Bishop g3. Queen d3. Queen h4. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Knight f3. Pawn g6. Pawn c4. Bishop g7. Knight c3. Castles kingside. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Bishop e2. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Knight e1. Knight d7. Bishop e3. Pawn f5. Pawn f3. Pawn f4. Bishop f2. Pawn g5. Pawn b4. Knight f6. Pawn c5. Knight g6. Pawn takes d6. Pawn takes d6. Rook c1. Rook f7. Pawn a4. Bishop f8. Pawn a5. Bishop d7. Knight b5. Pawn g4. Knight c7. Pawn g3. Knight takes a8. Knight h5. King h1. Pawn takes f2. Rook takes f2. Knight g3. King g1. Queen takes a8. Bishop c4. Pawn a6. Queen d3. Queen a7. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b5. Bishop takes b5. Knight h1.